Now that the virtual machine has started, we enter enable mode using the enable command, and then the global configuration mode by using the configure terminal command. Then we use the host name access1 command to give the device its host name. And then we also enter line configuration mode with the command line console 0 to enter the logging synchronous command. That way, when we get syslog message updates during our configurations, it won't affect the commands that we type in the command line. It'll keep everything looking much more neat as well. The first thing we will do is configure the ether channel between dist1 and access1. So the first thing we do is enter the interface range gigabit Ethernet command. This way we can enter all 4 Ethernet ports configuration mode at the same time. The configuration for the ether channel is identical between the 4 ports. This way we can just enter the command one time for all 4 ports. So the first command we enter is the switchboard trunk encapsulation.1q command. This configures the interface's encapsulation protocol that they should use on the frames that are traveling over the trunk links. We also enter the switchport mode trunk command to statically assign the operational mode of the ports as trunk mode. And finally, we enter the channel group 10 mode passive command. This sets the channel group protocol to the link aggregation control protocol, and more specifically they're set to passive, which means they will become link aggregation control protocol links if the other side of the link is actively trying to become a link aggregation control protocol port. So next we'll move into dist1 and do the layer 2 ether channel configuration. Before we do that, we'll give it a host name of dist1 and then enter line configuration mode to enter the logging synchronous command to keep our syslog messages looking clean. Next, we enter the interface range gigabit Ethernet command, again to enter all 4 ports simultaneously to enter identical commands. This is where the Cisco Modeling Labs platform works really well when making these types of configurations. This way I can reference the topology interface just to double check before I make any configurations. So now that we're in interface configuration mode for these 4 ports, we enter the switchport trunk encapsulation.1q command, followed by switchport mode trunk to statically configure all 4 ports as trunk links. Finally, the channel group 10 mode active command to make these 4 ports actively try to become link aggregation control protocol ports. They'll communicate with the ports on the other side of the ether channel, which will bring up the ether channel. And we can confirm this by using the show ether channel summary command. And from the output of the command, we can see that the S means layer 2, U means in use. So this ether channel is a layer 2, it's in use using the LACP protocol. Now we'll enter the interface configuration mode for each of our desktop ports. We'll configure them to be static ports by entering the switchport mode access command. And then we'll also assign the port to participate in a specific VLAN by entering the switchport access VLAN command. So when we do this, all of the 4 ports that are connected to the desktops will be in separate VLANs. And then we'll use inter-VLAN routing to communicate between the desktops. When doing these types of configurations, it's really useful to use the up arrow. Here you can see I just up arrowed to the last switchboard access VLAN 30 command, deleted the 30, put in a 40, and now I have the correct configuration. It can save you time when you're doing your configurations to use the up arrow. These are layer 3 switches, so we use the IP routing command and global configuration to enable the routing features on the layer 3 switch. This layer 3 switch will be participating in inter-VLAN routing, so we need to create the 4 VLANs that'll be participating in the inter-VLAN routing. So we use the VLAN 10, 20, 30, 40 to create the 4 VLANs we need simultaneously. Next, we use the interface VLAN 10 command to enter interface configuration mode for VLAN 10, and we configure the IP address 192.168.1.1 for a /24 gateway IP address for VLAN 10. We statically assigned the default gateway IP addresses on all of our desktops. And then we gave our desktops static IP addresses. So when we turn on our desktops, we'll be able to ping our default gateways. The other part of this configuration requires the no shutdown command. When you enter the interface configuration mode for a VLAN, the VLAN is shut down by default. So here I'm entering the no shutdown command to bring the interface up. And we can see here we're getting the syslog messages that interface VLAN 30 has changed its state to up. Now enter the show IP interface brief command to confirm that the VLAN's IP addresses are correct. And then that's the last part of the inter-VLAN routing configuration over the layer 2 Etherchannel. Then we can test the configuration by using the ping command to ping our default gateways and then our neighboring desktop computers, which are in different VLANs and different subnets. And you can see here I pinged my default gateway, and now I'll ping the IP address of the desktop in VLAN 40. And then we can see we're getting a response. So we've successfully set up inter-VLAN routing on this left side of the local area network here. Next, we're going to move into layer 3 Etherchannel configurations on dist 1 and dist 2. So this particular switch has 9 different links. So it can get a little confusing when you start to try to configure dual ether channels. But since we did our proper labeling, we can see here on the left is dist 1, on the right is dist 2. And with that connectivity tab, we can verify which ports that we need to configure. So now we'll enter the interface range gigabit Ethernet 1/0-3 command to enter the interface configuration mode of those 4 ports. For the layer 3 ether channel, we have to enter the no switchboard command to turn the ports into routed ports, giving them layer 3 capabilities, which means we can assign the interfaces an IP address. So what we'll do is bundle these 4 ports into an ether channel using the channel-group 15 mode on command. So now that the 4 ports are participating in this ether channel and that we entered the no switchboard command, we can assign an IP address to the port channel itself. And so we'll enter the IP address 10.99.99.1 255.255.252 command to give that port channel interface an IP address. Then we'll do the exact same configuration on disk 2 to complete the layer 3 Etherchannel configuration. So here on disk 2, we'll use the interface range gigabit Ethernet command to enter the 4 ports on the other end of the layer 3 Ether channel. We'll enter the no switch port to turn the ports into routed ports, giving them layer 3 functionality. And then we'll also enter the channel -group 15 mode on command to have these 4 ports participate in the same Ether channel. And then finally, we'll enter the port channel interface and give it an IP address in the same subnet as the IP address on the Ether channel on disk 1. So we'll enter the IP address 10.99.99.2.255.255.255.252 command to give it an IP address in the same subnet. And that'll complete the layer 3 Ether channel configuration. To verify the configuration, we use the show Ether channel summary command. So the R refers to a layer 3 configuration, and the U refers to in use. So this port channel 15 is a layer 3 port channel, and it's in use. So now we'll come back to disk 2, enter a show Ether channel summary command, and we can see the SU refers to layer 2 in use, and the RU refers to layer 3 in use. So this switch has a layer 2 and a layer 3 Ether channel configured on it. So now we're going to move back into access switch 2 and configure the desktop ports to be access ports. The first one we'll do is interface gigabit Ethernet 0/1. Once we're in interface configuration mode, we enter the switch port mode access command to configure it to be a static access port. And then we'll enter the switch port access VLAN 50 command to have this port only participate in VLAN 50. And then we'll repeat the configuration on each port that is connected to the desktop with the respective VLAN that it will participate in. So again, for example, here at the end we use the switch port access VLAN 80 command for gigabit Ethernet port 1/0. And for the last part of the configuration, we'll go into interface gigabit Ethernet 0/0 and configure it to be a trunk port with the switch port trunk encapsulation .1q command, followed by the switch port mode trunk command. Now we'll complete the configuration for access switch 2. Now enter the do show interfaces gigabit Ethernet 0/0 switch port command to verify the operational mode is set to trunk. With most show commands in global configuration mode, if you use the keyword do, you can execute the show command in configuration mode, which is useful. As we can see here, we can look at the configuration of the switch port without leaving configuration mode. For the last part of the configuration, we'll move back into DIS2, which is a layer 3 switch that has its routing capabilities enabled. And so now we'll move into interface gigabit Ethernet 0/0 and enter the no switchboard command to turn it into a routed port, which gives us the ability to assign the port IP addresses. It also gives us the capability to assign IP addresses to sub-interfaces. So in this particular example, we'll interface gigabit Ethernet 0/0.50 to enter the sub-interface configuration mode for this port. Once we're in sub-interface configuration mode, we have to enter the Encapsulation.1Q vlan command to configure the encapsulation type for the sub-interface and what VLAN it will participate in. And then we can assign the sub-interface the IP address. So for this first VLAN, the IP address will be 192.168.5.1, 255.255.255.0. Now we'll go into each sub-interface, configure the encapsulation type and the VLAN that it will participate in, and its IP address. And then that will finish the router on a stick configuration and allow these desktop PCs the ability to ping each other, indicating that they have network connectivity. Now that I've finished the configuration, I use the show IP interface brief command just to double check the IP addresses are correct, and then we're going to turn on all the desktops and then start pinging one another to verify our network connectivity. So on this first desktop, we'll ping ourselves just to make sure everything's okay. And then now we'll ping our default gateway, see we're getting a response. And then we'll ping the PC on the far side of the local area network. So this proves that we've configured router on a stick for this layer 3 switch. So what we have now is a local area network on the left that's using inter-VLAN routing to communicate with 4 subnets on 4 different VLANs. And then the layer 3 switch on the right, DIS2, is using router on a stick to have 4 subnets and 4 different VLANs for these 4 different desktops. So now they cannot ping each other without a static route from the local area network on the left to the right, and then a static route on the local area network from the right to the left. So the first static route we'll configure is on DIS2. So we enter the IP route 192.168.1.0, 255.255.255.0, 10.99.99.1 command. The 192.168.1.0 is the other local area subnet, and the 10.99.99.1 address is the port channel address on DIS1. So that's our next hop IP address in the static IP routing configuration. Each static route will have the same next hop IP address. And then we'll go in and enter the IP address and subnet mask for each local area network on the other side to configure our 4 static routes to the other local area network. If we did a ping command right now, it would still fail because DIS1 doesn't have a route back to any of the other subnets on the right side of the network. So now we have to go to DIS1 and configure static routes from the left side of the topology to the right side. To remove a static route from the configuration, you enter the keyword no in front of the IP route command. So for example, I'll come in here and type in the wrong static route of the 192.168.4.0 subnet. That subnet is on this left side topology. So it's the incorrect static route configuration. So we'll go ahead and enter the command and then use the no command to then remove the static route configuration. There are a lot of Cisco configuration commands that allow you to put the keyword no in front of them to return the configuration to before you enter the command. So now we'll use the up arrow, enter the correct IP address of 192.168.5.0. And then we can use the up arrow, change the subnet numbers, and now we have our 4 static routes to dis2. Then we do the do show IP route to verify our static route configuration. And there we can see our static routes. Now we can go back into the VLAN 10 PC and attempt to ping the VLAN 80 PC. And we can see that we're getting a response, which lets us know our static routing configuration is correct. So now we're going to keep expanding our topology. We'll begin by placing 4 switches in the center, or what will be the center of the topology when we're finished. These 4 switches are going to have a full mesh topology when we're done. And then we're also going to add a router here that will eventually connect to another router where we'll configure some more networks. So the first thing we're going to do is label the central switches as Core 1, Core 2, Core 3, and Core 4. This router we're going to call Area 51, and it's going to be connected to another router that will connect to the president and the vice president's personal computers. And then this Area 51 router will also have 2 local area networks off it representing the Speaker of the House and higher level generals. So after labeling it at Area 51, we add this router up here on the upper left for our branch 1 network that we're going to build. And then this upper right router we label Secure Zone, which is going to demonstrate some security features that Cisco offers. So now that we have everything labeled, we'll start making our connections. Every router's gigabit Ethernet 0/0 port will connect to the switches. So that'll be our first connection that we'll make, is from the switches to the routers. And then now we're going to make our full mesh topology connections and then start turning on the virtual machines and start our next part of the configuration process. So we'll turn on all the devices that will need for this next part of the video. So we're going to focus on the Area 51 part of the network. We're going to insert another router and call it Area 51 Vault. These routers will be connected to each other, and then each router will be connected to a switch and each switch will have two local area networks off of it. So after I drag out all of the devices, we'll start labeling them. So we just label this first switch VIP switch 1 for VIP, and then we'll label the other switch VIP switch 2. And now that everything's labeled, we can start making our connections. These 4 desktops are going to use static IP addresses. Each desktop will be in its own VLAN, so we'll have 4 different VLANs. I just go over here to the VLAN 80 PC and copy its static IP address configuration, and then just paste it over here on the speaker of the house's desktop to have it, and then just change the IP address to what I want it to be. So for this network, it's going to be a 192.168.10.0 network. So my IP address will be 192.168.10.100, and the default gateway is 192.168.10.1. Before adding the static IP addresses to the other desktops, I'm going to label everything. So this first one will be speaker for speaker of the house, general for higher level generals, and then POTUS for President of the United States, and then Vice POTUS for Vice President of the United States. So we'll finish out our static IP addressing pre-configuration on the rest of the desktops, and then we'll power them on, and they will be ready to go. So now we're going to go into VIP switch 1, and we're going to configure the trunk link between VIP switch 1 and Area 51 and the access links to the desktops. So we'll give it a host name and then enter the logging synchronous command in line configuration mode to keep our syslog messages looking clean. Now we'll enter the interface configuration mode for Gigabit Ethernet 0/0, which is the port connecting to Area 51. And we'll enter the switchport trunk encapsulation .1q command, followed by the switchport mode trunk command to have the port be statically configured to be a trunk port. We'll start with Gigabit Ethernet 0/1, which is the speaker of the house's port. We'll enter the switchport mode access command, followed by the switchport mode access VLAN 10 command. Then we'll use the up arrow to get into the interface configuration mode for Gigabit Ethernet 0/2. We'll enter the switchport mode access command, followed by the switchport access vlan 20 command. And that will complete the VIP switch 1 configuration. And now we'll move over to VIP switch 2 and configure it. Like all the other devices in the video so far, we'll start by giving the device a host name and then entering the logging asynchronous command to help keep our syslog messages looking clean. Now we'll enter the interface configuration mode for Gigabit Ethernet 0/0, which is the port connecting to the Area 51 vault router. We'll enter the switch port trunk encapsulation .1q command, followed by the switchport mode trunk command to make this port a static trunk port. Next, we'll configure the access ports. The first one will be the President's port, which is Gigabit Ethernet 0/1. We'll use the switchport mode access command to configure it to be a static access port, followed by the switchport access vlan 77 command. Now we'll go into interface Gigabit Ethernet 0/2, enter the switchport mode access command, followed by the switchport access vlan 7 command. And that will finish off the configurations for the VIP switches. All of our devices are now powered on, and the first thing we will do is go into the Area 51 router, configure its host name, and the logging asynchronous command in line configuration mode. Then we'll enter the command interface Gigabit Ethernet 0/2 to enter the configuration mode for the port connecting to VIP switch 1. We're going to enter the no shutdown command because routers have their ports turned off by default. So you have to enter the no shutdown command to enable them. Once the port is enabled, we'll jump into the sub interfaces and configure them. The first sub interface we'll configure is Gigabit Ethernet 0/2.10. Once we're in sub interface configuration mode, we use the encapsulation .1q10 command, followed by the IP address 192.168.10.1, 255.255.255.0 command to configure the sub interface to be the default gateway for VLAN 10, which is the speaker's VLAN. Now we'll use the up arrows to go back to the sub interface configuration command and modify it to port Gigabit Ethernet 0/2.20. Use the encapsulation .1q20 command, followed by the IP address 192.168.20.1, 255.255.255.0 command to finish the router on a stick configuration for this left side of the network. We're also going to configure an IP address on the connection between Area 51 and the Area 51 vault, which is Gigabit Ethernet 0/1. We're going to give it the IP address 10.97.97.1, 255.255.255.240. This will give us 14 usable IP addresses in the subnet, and that becomes more important later when we do the NAT configuration, the network address translation. But for now, it's like any other interface. We gave it the IP address in a subnet, enter the no shutdown command to enable the interface. So now we've finished our configurations on this left side network here. So we'll power on all of our devices, and then we're going to move into the area 51 vault router, assign it its host name, and like with all the other devices, enter line configuration mode to enter the logging asynchronous command to keep our syslog messages looking clean. The first thing we'll do is we'll go into interface gigabit Ethernet 0/1 and enable the port with the no shutdown command. After the port is enabled, we'll go into the sub-interface configuration mode for gigabit Ethernet 0/1.77. Once we're in the interface configuration mode, we'll enter the encapsulation .1Q77 command, followed by the IP address 192.168.77.1, 255.255.255.240 command. This gives us 14 usable IP addresses for the subnet. So it's a little bit more secure because there's only 14 IP addresses that can be on the local area network. Whereas if you use a /24, there's 254 possible IP addresses. If an attacker needs an IP address for whatever reason, they will only have 14 possibilities, as opposed to 254 with the /24 networks. So now we use the up arrow and then enter the encapsulation .1Q7 command, followed by the IP address 192.168.7.1, 255.255.255.240 command. And so now we've configured both of our sub-interfaces as default gateways for our two different VLANs, which are 7 and 77. Now we will configure an IP address on the interface that is connected to Area 51, which is gigabit Ethernet 0/0, and we'll give it the IP address 10.97.97.2, 255.255.255.240. And so now the interfaces between these two routers are in the same subnet. I use the show interface brief command to double check the IP address assignments are correct. When I copy and pasted the static configuration into the president and the vice president's static IP address, I used the /24 IP address in the startup configuration. So if you want to edit the configurations, you have to wipe the node. And then once you wipe the node, it'll give us the ability to edit the startup configuration. So we'll go in, change the correct subnet mask to a /28, which is the .240 subnet, and change the static IP address to 192.168.77.7, because we only have 14 IP addresses in that first range. So using a 7 is okay because it's in that range of usable IP addresses. Now we have to do the same thing on the vice POTUS. We'll have to wipe the configuration, update the subnet mask and the correct IP address, and then save the configuration, boot up the desktops, and now they are ready to go. For the initial configuration, we're going to want these 4 PCs to have IP connectivity between them. We'll achieve the IP connectivity with static routing on this network. So the first command we'll enter on Area 51 Vault is the IP route 192.168.10.0, 255.255.255.0, 10.97.97.1 This will configure the first static route, and then we'll use the up arrow and modify the IP subnet and enter the command to configure the second static route. For this next part of the video, I wanted to demonstrate the no command really quick. So here we'll put in a static route to a /24 network where the static configurations are for /28 addresses. So without the correct static IP route, we won't have IP connectivity, network connectivity. Using the show IP interface brief command can be tricky because there's no subnet mask. But what we're about to do is use the no shutdown command on the link between Area 51 and Area 51 Vault. So we'll enter the no shutdown command to enable the port. And that still won't fix our problem because our static route is configured for a /24. And we need it to be configured as a /28. The Area 51 Vault router is configured correctly. We use the show IP route command to verify the static routes are okay with the proper subnets. Now we'll come back to Area 51, do a show IP route command. And we'll see the two incorrect static routes that are configured on the router. So what we can do is use the up arrow to go back to the routes we want to get rid of, and then use the word no in front of them to remove them from the static routing configuration. So use a do show IP route to just verify that I removed the static route from the configuration. So we still have to remove the 192.168.77.0/24 static route. So we'll just use the up arrow again and then put the no keyword in front of the static routing command to remove the static route. And then now we'll configure our last static route, which is to the vice POTUS PC. And so now when we do the do show IP route, we can see that we have the correct subnet masks on our static routes. And now we'll have IP connectivity between all four subnets. Now we'll ping the president's PC from the speaker's PC to verify IP connectivity from the left side network to the right side network. Then we'll also ping the vice president's PC